stories today. So thank you for joining us and take it away.
Well, hello and welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here this evening. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to hear about Wisconsin's weird history from the safety of wherever you're watching this program from. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you here. Just give me one moment as I get this going. There we go. And just one last thing. Okay, great. So again, welcome everyone. This is the Bizarre History of Wisconsin. My name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter this evening. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, reports of UFOs, alien abductions, you name it. If it's weird, weird place, odd people, just strange and has anomalies associated with it, I've traveled around the globe in search of these bizarre tales and stories. But what I found on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore this evening. Wisconsin's strange history, mainly from the 1800s to the early 1900s. For the next 45 or 50 minutes, we will take a tour to some of the weirdest stories you may have never heard of. But if you listen to the rest of the country, they believe that we're weird in Wisconsin for other reasons. Yeah. If you believe the rest of the country, you would think that everyone in Wisconsin was a dairy farmer, that we are all crazy Packer fans who do nothing but eat cheese and drink beer. And even though this last one may be true, I'm going to be talking about a different Wisconsin, a more bizarre, a more sinister, and certainly more fascinating part of our state. If at any time you have questions through the program, feel free to throw them in the chat room. We will have plenty of time after the program to talk about these weird cases. We're going to look at some of the weirdest cases that Wisconsin has to offer. So what are we going to explore tonight? Well, everything from bizarre deaths and ghosts all the way down to weird people and UFOs. We'll be talking about so much uniqueness that it would make the great Wisconsin folklorist Charles E. Brown, who you see in this photo, happy in his grave. I've also thrown what I call keep in minds, things about Wisconsin you just might not have known. For instance, the era in which we're talking about tonight, there were only about 775,000 people in the state. Today, we have nearly 6 million people in our state. This means that back then, they had a lot more room to spread out and be weird. And believe me, they took full advantage of that weirdness. So with that, let's explore weird Wisconsin. First stop, bizarre deaths. Today, if you open up your newspaper and flip to the obituary section, you will probably find cases like this. Old man Lewis died peacefully, surrounded by his loving family. No details, no cause of death, no other information at all. But I thought it was weird because the era in which I was researching, the obituaries I was discovering were a little bit different. Because I was finding obituaries like this. Suicide is gruesome. whole top of his head blown off by the blast. Quite a bit different than dying peacefully surrounded by your loving family. And it illustrates that people back then were more comfortable with death. It was all around them. They also loved good headlines, which brings us to our first case. Cold bath causes death. Talks about a woman out of Beloit had the habit of taking a cold bath every morning. One morning she died, probably a heart attack or a brain aneurysm, but that didn't sell newspapers. Cold bath causes death sold newspapers. And I put this as our first case tonight for two reasons. One, it was said to have happened in Beloit, but I couldn't find it in any of the Beloit newspapers. I found it in my hometown paper, the Eau Claire Weekly. And that happened quite a bit. I'd often find something that was said to have happened in Superior, but covered in Lake Geneva or vice versa. So half the fun tonight when you see these stories is deciding for yourself whether or not you actually think they're true. The second reason, and what I mean by that is that it could have been true, or it might have been a slow news day, and they made the story up thinking nobody was going to Google it in 1903 to see if it was true. And the second, myself here, there we go. Should be able to hear me again.
Sorry, I accidentally hit that. I apologize.
No problem. When you're dealing with the weird things are going to happen. But the second reason I chose this is that someone must have read this article. A gentleman. We'll see him later in the program. We'll catch up with him and realize why he read this story and what it meant to him. But when you hear of people dying in the old days at a young age, don't feel too bad for them. The average life expectancy in 1900 was only 47 years of age. So when they died, they didn't lose out on a lot of life expectancy. This next case, I have dozens of these, and it talks about a man who saw death coming. And I have a lot of these cases where people were foretold that they were going to die. They felt like they knew they were going to die at a certain time on a certain day. So they would go around telling everybody, I'm going to die next Thursday at 12:01. And sure enough, people died when they predicted they would. But what I love about this story in particular is the newspaper said that before this gentleman died, he went out and did one last thing. And that last thing was he went out and paid off every single one of his debts. So when he died, he could die with a clear name. Take that versus today, if someone knows they're going to die, they're probably on a vacation or a cruise, much different than it was many years ago. People fear dying, but almost as much, they fear not dying and being buried alive. The fear of being buried 6 feet under while you're still breathing. And it's great folklore. It's a great urban legend, but is it anything more? Was anyone ever buried alive? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, they would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem a little silly today with modern science and medicine, but our grandparents, they were so terrified of being buried alive, they came up with several inventions. My favorite was this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like. It was a bell you could have on top of your grave with a rope on a pole going down into your casket. So if you awoke in time and found yourself buried alive, all you'd have to do is pull that rope, it would ring the bell and alert the caretaker who lived there that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. Problem is, on many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare, thinking everyone was buried alive. In fact, after your loved one died, it was your responsibility to sit around the grave, making sure that they were truly dead, that they wouldn't rise up and come back from the grave. But I'm going to stop talking about dying right now. Not because I don't find these deaths fascinating, I do, but because it's dangerous. In my research, I found dozens and dozens of cases where people were merely talking about death when the Grim Reaper came after them. It seems as all you have to do is talk about dying and it might come true. So I'm going to move on to our next category while I still can. That category is ghosts and haunted places. You cannot throw a rock in Wisconsin without hitting a place that is thought to be haunted or has a haunted reputation. One of my favorite places is right outside of a small place called Meriden, or Meriden if you're a local, near Menominee, Wisconsin, on the western side, not Menominee on the eastern side. And it's here along the lake that the legend is many years ago, a young girl was coming up on a steamship when she lost her life on the river. At that time, an entire town lived out on the island. They had a post office, many businesses. And when the young girl died, they named the place Meriden in her honor. As you can see, the place is abandoned, but it's not empty. Many believe the place is haunted by the ghostly spirit of that young woman named Meriden, who acts like a siren out in the water. Those who have seen her claim that she will try to beckon you in by saying things like, "Help me, I can't swim. I'm drowning. Please don't leave me, save me." It is said that if you're foolish enough to do so, she will pull you under and you will meet your watery grave and spend eternity with Meriden. The best part is you can camp on the island. You don't need to register. You don't need to pay. You can simply just camp out there and try this dare in the darkness of night and see if Meriden will pull you under. Keep in mind, Door County has more lighthouses, miles of shoreline, and more state parks than any other county in the United States. They may also have more ghosts per county than anywhere else as well. In 1874, the good people of the Fox Valley area of Wisconsin had no idea that when they read this obituary about Mrs. George Miller, that it would lead to one of Wisconsin's most infamous hauntings. And it involves Riverside Cemetery in Appleton. This is the final resting place of Mrs. George Miller, better known as Kate Blood. It was said that when she was alive, she murdered her husband and their 3 young children. Therefore, she would not be allowed burial inside the cemetery proper, which is why she's down by the river all by herself. In fact, if you were not looking for her grave, you probably wouldn't find it. But that's not the scary part. The scary part comes in the fact that many people who venture out to the graveyard often report at night seeing what appears to be some black, hooded, sinister-looking figure standing behind her grave. When they try to get a closer look or snap a photo, this thing simply vanishes into thin air. But my favorite part is the dare. And the dare involves that if you go to the graveyard and if you're quiet and watch the tombstone, you will see what appears to be blood oozing out of the grave. And I say it appears to be blood because witnesses I've spoken with claim that when they went to touch it, it was dry to the touch, even though they swore it was blood oozing out of the gravestone. So I spent months and months researching this case just to discover that Kate Blood did not murder her husband. Well, actually, I just read the tombstone here. You can see that her husband lived much longer than she did. And in fact, she did not murder any of her children. But the stories, even though they're not quite right, they still have experiences out there. People walking along the Stations of the Cross will see mysterious balls of light. They'll hear disembodied voices, all kinds of oddities out at the cemetery, leading many to believe that Kate Blood is one of the most haunted areas in the entire state. I love this category. Today, we could probably explain a lot of these cases with science, but back then they had no idea what was going on. They were just puzzled over the simplest of stories. Here's a case of a man changing colors. And I have a lot of these cases, African American men and women looking more Caucasian and vice versa. It was happening, they thought, because of chemicals in a lot of the industry they used back then. This person was a tanning employee at a tannery, and it was thought they were changing colors due to that chemical process. But people changing colors in the old days was very common all the time. Keep in mind, the first practical typewriter was designed in Milwaukee, just one of the many, many firsts and inventions that we lay claim to here in Wisconsin. This next case I call good news and bad news. As you can see, it was a woman in Wausau who 20 years ago went blind. Then she regained her sight. Doctors couldn't explain it. They thought it was an act of providence, an act of God, a spontaneous healing, a spiritual healing. And I call these good news, bad news because I have dozens of them. And they're always involving people who get something back, whether it's their eyesight, their ability to walk or talk, their hearing, something. And I call them good news, bad news because in about 99% of the cases I found, shortly after that person gets something they've lost back, they die shortly after, just like this woman did. So the good news is you can see again. The bad news is you're going to see the Grim Reaper coming for you. Very weird why at the end of their life, so many people get that ability back. Mysterious creatures. These are creatures science says do not exist. Skeptics say they can't exist. Yet every year, people were coming face to face with these monstrosities. Imagine opening up your newspaper and reading a headline like this: "Child is human monster, half dog, half man." The body of this child was covered with hair, and it had a long projecting nose and a low forehead. But the best part of this newspaper article is the last sentence there. It was said that the mother was scared by a dog jumping on her about a month ago. Back in the 1800s and up until early 1900s, when a woman was pregnant, if she was scared while she was pregnant by any animal, whether it was an elephant or a snake, it was said that the child would come out looking like the animal that scared the mother in some weird form of maternal imprinting. So, of course, this mother was scared by a dog, so her child came out looking like a dog. 1905, you think someone would have taken a photograph of this half dog, half man, but no known photograph exists. Most likely, this was not a new species. Most likely, it was somebody born with a genetic disorder called hypertrichosis, which those afflicted with this disorder usually grow hair all over their face and torso, upper torso of their body. Normally, these people in the old days would get put on display at museums as freaks of nature, or freaks as they were called. Oftentimes, if they were lucky, their parents would allow them to run off and spend their life in the carnival with people like P.T. Barnum of Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus, and later Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. Now, believe it or not, many of their parents allowed them to go and live their life with these men on the road. The reason being is that the freaks would make a lot of money and they would have a much better life than they would back on the farm in Wisconsin. At one point, both P.T. Barnum and one of his freaks of nature pictured here, General Tom Thumb, were two of the wealthiest men in America from being a freak of nature. So their parents would allow them. Keep in mind, Wisconsin claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before we get too excited, so do the states of Minnesota, California, Maine, Michigan, and Canada, the country of Canada, of course. We do know that the first written tales of Paul Bunyan came from Minnesota in the early 1900s. The first oral tales that we know of came from a logging camp north of Tomahawk in Wisconsin in the mid-1880s. But everybody knows Paul Bunyan, the most infamous lumberjack there is, of course, with his faithful companion, Babe the Blue Ox. But a lot of people have no idea how Paul and Babe actually met. Well, they met in Wisconsin. It was a terrible winter, kind of like it is this evening. It was the winter of the blue snow. The reason it was blue snow is the weather was so terrible that people were cursing a blue streak for so long that it turned the snow blue. If you look in the record books, they actually recorded it as two separate winters that season because that's how bad the weather was. It was so cold that year. What's that? How cold was it? It was so cold that fish grew fur to stay warm. That's how cold it was when Paul met Babe the Blue Ox. Babe was in the snow freezing. He had already turned blue because of the snow. So Paul took him into his camp, and like everything around Paul, he grew to an enormous size. And the rest of the story is well known. Paul and Babe have spent ever since roaming the north woods of the Great Lakes, watching and making the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota, clearing out the Dakotas, and so forth. Some say you can still see them up in the north woods when you're on your summer vacation. One person who claimed that he was responsible for the legend of Paul Bunyan was this gentleman, Eugene Shepard of Rhinelander. And if he was, or if he wasn't, he was certainly one of the first people to tell tales about Paul Bunyan, an early timber cruiser up in Rhinelander. But one story we do know came from Eugene Shepard was that of the hodag, this giant monster, huge snake-like beast with giant fangs, claws, spikes going down its back. Eugene Shepard claimed that he had encountered several of these creatures up in the north woods around the Rhinelander area. Eventually, with a group of hunters, he was able to capture one of these hodags, and he put it on display at carnivals and fairs throughout the Midwest, putting it on display for people willing to pay for it. Eventually, it became known that it was a hoax, and more people showed up to see it, wondering how he had hoaxed it than when it was thought to be legitimate. Eugene Shepard did admit that he hoaxed it, but only because he could not capture a live hodag that he had seen in the woods. It was too dangerous. Some say they're still around the Rhinelander area. I'll leave it up to you to venture out and capture your own hodag. Here I am on one of my expeditions over at Loch Ness in Scotland looking for the Loch Ness Monster. I'm the one in the blue without the really cool beard. But little did I know, if I wanted to see sea serpents, I should have stayed here in Wisconsin. Back in the 1800s and early 1900s, Wisconsin was overrun with sea monsters. As of today, I've collected over 40 different lakes, rivers, and streams in our state that all claim to have or had a sea monster in them. In fact, if you were a resort town in those days and you did not have a sea serpent story, you were missing out. You were losing out on tourists coming up from the Chicago area to spend their time and money at your resort. One of my favorite stories comes from where a lot of you are watching this from, Lake Geneva, Geneva Lake, thought to be home to many weird things in the lake, including a VW bus at the bottom, several boats that have made their watery grave at the bottom as well. Years ago, the place was filled with resorts all over the lakes. And it was here back in September of 1892 that a weird sighting took place. A man was out on Geneva Lake with his two kids fishing, having a wonderful time. Things were going great. They were about to call it a day when all of a sudden they saw a giant neck rise up out of the water, attached to some figure at least 30 feet long. Standing there in the boat in disbelief, they were too afraid to even move. The thing suddenly started moving toward them, creating such a mess in the water that it almost tipped over their boat. They feared it was coming to kill them. And just before it reached the boat, it descended into the water and left the man and the two children unharmed, at least physically. They raced back to the shoreline, gathered a group of men and women out to hunt these things, armed with their weapons, looking to capture this monster. Over the years, it had been seen so many times, locals started dubbing it Jenny, the lake monster of Lake Geneva. Although sightings in recent years have dwindled a bit, I still hope that the sea serpent is sitting around in the water waiting to terrorize tourists every single summer that are foolish enough to dip their toes in the waters of Geneva Lake. Keep in mind, Green Bay has the distinction of being Wisconsin's first city, incorporated in 1754, as you can read. But a lot of you travel a lot, and you may be saying to yourself, wait a minute, Chad, I go through Abbotsford quite a bit. They claim to be Wisconsin's first city. What gives? Well, they're right. They are Wisconsin's first city, alphabetically speaking, that is, which is why I never fall for their ruse. I keep driving. I never stop in Abbotsford. They're not going to trick me. Imagine finding this next creature, just like this Frank Morrow did, combining the characteristics of a cat and a rabbit. The head was that of a cat, the body like that of a rabbit. But again, this was 1910. You would think somebody would have taken a photograph of this new species, especially one as cool as being part rabbit, part cat. But as far as we know, no evidence of this creature has been presented to this very day. But mysterious creatures aren't the only oddities in Wisconsin. In fact, these next stories were so weird that they didn't fit into any known category, so I made a category all for themselves, including Whitewater, Wisconsin, known as Second Salem because of all the New Age study that was going on there. There are many stories about Whitewater legends of witches, the Witch's Tower, haunted graveyards, and many, many others. But my favorite story involves the library. Now, many say it's the university library, where others say it's the local public library. But regardless of to the origin, they talk that the library keeps under lock and key a mysterious book that is so deadly, everyone who checks it out goes crazy and ends up dying, either by their own hand or a hand of fate. And that 3 professors and many students have all died after checking this book out. I don't know who keeps returning it, but that's the legend that if you check this book out, you will die. It's been circulating for many years, the legend that is. I've spoken at the Whitewater Public Library many times, and they're adamant, telling me that they have no such book under lock and key, which is exactly what you would expect from sinister librarians trying to keep the book of the death away from everyone. So my advice is contact the library and the university and demand to see that book of the dead. Just make sure you have someone planned to return it after your death. Imagine waking up and finding these horned toads all over your property. That's exactly what happened in 1900 Appleton. The problem was here that they were finding these all over, but the creatures were not native to the area. They were only found in the southwest portion of the U.S. Skeptics claim that what happened was a tornado or thunderstorm picked up these creatures in California or out in the southwest, brought them to Wisconsin where the storm lost power and deposited them all over Appleton. The problem with that theory was that there were no other frogs, no other fish, no other animals whatsoever, just these horned toads that were being found everywhere in Appleton. We have all kinds of weird stories of things falling from the sky, from blood to angel hair, raining, all kinds of weird things in Wisconsin. What about this giant that was found in Ferryville? One of the many giant skeletons unearthed in Wisconsin. This one was 8 or 9 or maybe even taller in height, and it was unearthed. It was 1909 when they found this skeleton, which someone 9 feet tall prior to 1909 would have truly been a giant. Remember, the average height of an American male in 1909 was only 5 feet 6 inches in height. In fact, the largest person ever on record is that of Robert Wadlow of Alton, Illinois. He died while he was still growing. He was a wee bit shy of being 9 feet tall when he died. They have a life-size statue of him in Alton, Illinois. You can go there and see how truly gigantic he was. They also have one at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Auditorium in Wisconsin Dells, too, if you're interested. They found him in what archaeologists call effigy mounds. These were thought to be sacred native burial grounds raised up in the earth, often in the shape of an animal that could best be viewed from the sky. As you can see, we're losing more and more of these every single year. A lot of you are probably religious watching this. Fair warning, this next young man was religious as well, but he went crazy from reading too many religious texts because everyone who came over, he asked them if they wanted to converse with the guardian angels because he could see them. And he wanted to know if anyone wanted to talk. It went on for so long that people thought he was insane. They then brought him to the insane asylum because he would not stop talking about angels. But I don't think this young man was insane or crazy. I think he was simply ahead of his time. Because in 1905, if you told people that you could talk to angels, they would and did lock you up for being insane. But today, you can make a pretty good living doing angel readings for people, talking to their guardian angels and charging them. So again, he was simply way ahead of his time. Keep in mind, during Prohibition, every big name gangster of the day made their way to Wisconsin for vacation or crime, including Al Capone, Babyface Nelson, Tommy Carroll, John Dillinger, George Bugs Moran, you name it. if they were a big name, they made their way to Wisconsin. Many of the evidence of their crimes, bullet holes and the like, are still left behind in Wisconsin on many buildings you can find. How about this tragic story of an animal committing suicide? It talks about a dog going into Hutchinson's Saloon in La Crosse, which is no longer there. Apparently, people treated it horribly and kicked it and said, "Get out of here, you old mutt." The dog went down to the railroad tracks. According to witnesses, they saw it put its head on the train track and it waited. And it waited. Eventually, a train came rumbling by. The engineer spotted the dog, blew the whistle, tried to brake. The dog was said to have just looked up at him, then put his head back down and waited until the train ran him over. Witnesses declared that it was a case of dog suicide. Very strange indeed. Or what about this? Old clock stops when the owner died. The clock, which had been in the family for over 40 years, suddenly stopped after the owner died. The owner died at 4:25. Anyone want to guess when the clock stopped? You got it, 4:25. I still receive reports of these, of people coming home from the hospital after losing a loved one to find a clock in the house stopped at the moment of death. Or people will get a call telling them the unfortunate news about a loved one, only to look down and see their watch has stopped too. I'm still waiting to get a report of a cell phone, a phone timer, a watch stopping, a clock stopping on a phone, but I have none as of today. This is a great category. Don't worry, you're not going to see any of your in-laws or neighbors in here. This is too long ago. But Wisconsin has a long history of weird and unique people coming from our state. Keep in mind, the Ringling Brothers Circus staged their first show in Baraboo in 1884. And if you have not been to the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, you need to get there. It's a treasure. Not only do they have a full circus all summer long, not this summer, of course, but every other non-pandemic summer they do. They also have more circus memorabilia, including the wagon carts, the tapestry, the banners, the advertisement, more circus memorabilia than anywhere else in the entire world. Again, you must go and see Circus World Museum, a true treasure in Baraboo. Keep in mind, though, that not all monsters that we talked about earlier, not all of them tend to look like this. In fact, some monsters in Wisconsin are even scarier than this, because some monsters in our state, well, those monsters looked a little bit more like this. If you don't recognize this gentleman, his name is Ed Gein, and you might recognize some of the movies they based on his life, including Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and many, many others. Now, most people just remember Ed as a murderer, which is true, he was, but before he was captured in Plainfield, he was well-liked, odd, but well-liked. He would often babysit for kids and bring his neighbors over what he called a venison stew for them to eat. One neighbor told me he remembered his mother getting this stew, and it had such a bad smell to it, she threw it away, which is good for her because even though Ed was a killer, his real passion was to wait until it got dark. Then he would fire up his vehicle, head down to the nearby cemeteries, and dig up the graves of women that reminded him of his own deceased mother. He would then bring those remains back to his house where he lived in squalor. He would make them into lampshades and furniture and many other despicable things in his home. He had skulls all over the house. But when Ed really got a bug in his system, what he would do is make an entire outfit of this material, and he would wear it like a demented Halloween costume as he danced under the moonlight in his front yard. And when we caught Gein and discovered how truly evil and horrific his crimes were, they wanted to open his house as a Museum of Horrors, a roadside attraction that you could go see. But before they were able to do so, it mysteriously burned to the ground. Townsfolk torched it, allegedly. When it was discovered what Geen was doing, he was deemed a monster, and rightly so. But 50 years before he was wearing that material, a young girl in Madison was doing the same thing, wearing shoes made from human skin. The odd part was she got these from a friend of hers who was studying in Chicago to be a doctor. They were from the leg of an unknown man who died in the streets. The newspaper said everywhere she went, wearing these shoes of human skin, she was complimented. People loved them. So much so that she told the newspaper she had more material left over to make a matching purse to go along with the shoes. What happened to the shoes and purse? We don't know. Perhaps they're in your basement or your attic right now, but we've lost track of what happened to these gruesome accessories. Keep in mind, we have nearly 15,000 lakes here in Wisconsin, which is many more than the 12,000 that Minnesota has, even though they're known as the land of 10,000 lakes, which always reminds me of that old joke, Minnesota, 10,000 lakes and 3 fish, which is probably why they're always here in our state fishing on our lakes. Remember the first story we looked at tonight? Cold bath causes death? Well, this next man must have read that story because he didn't like baths. In fact, you could say he hated them so much that he went 60 years without taking one. He was 62, so he can do the math and figure out when his last bath was. The best part of the article was the sentence, the experience of removing the accumulation of 60 years of filth, best left untold. The man escaped from the poor farm because they wanted him to take a bath once a week. He said, if I have to bathe once a week, I'm going to die. So he snuck out and escaped instead. That's how much he truly hated taking a bath. And times were tough in the old days. But this next woman took it a little too far, I think, because when her husband died, she asked the dentist to remove his false teeth, not because she wanted something to remember her husband by, but she wanted the teeth and the dentist to remold them to fit into her mouth. The reason she wanted her dead husband's false teeth was that now that her husband was dead, she had to get back into the dating pool, and the new teeth would allow her to attract more suitors than the teeth she currently had. And believe it or not, the dentist did it. He remolded her dead husband's false teeth into her mouth. I don't know if she was courted more at the time, but really, really scary and creepy, if you ask me. Psychic phenomena. This is a weird category. A lot of you watching this program, you're probably married, and without a doubt, all of you are happily married. But if you know somebody that isn't happily married, they might want to try what this next person did. They claimed that they were hypnotized into marriage. This young woman said that her husband hypnotized her. And sure enough, under oath in court, he testified he did hypnotize her into marriage. Obviously, the marriage didn't last very long after this. I don't know how well judges would look at that excuse today, but you may want to give it a try. And the last category we're going to explore this evening is that of unidentified flying objects. Skeptics claim that the only reason we believe in UFOs, the only reason we see UFOs, is because of Hollywood. TV shows like The X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries and movies like Men in Black and Independence Day, that's why we see and believe in UFOs. But what you'll see here in these next few stories is that people in Wisconsin were seeing odd things in the sky long before Mulder and Scully were out there investigating. It should come as no surprise that we have reports of UFOs in Wisconsin, because not only do we have the UFO capital of the world here, we have 3 of them. The cities of Dundee, Elmwood, and Bellevue all claim to be the UFO capital of the world. All 3 have UFO Day festivals where you can go and see for yourself whether the UFOs are visiting. What about this strange case out of Green Bay, 1895? A weird ball of fire hanging on the horizon for about 10 minutes, seen by many, many people. And I threw this photo on the bottom, not because it shows Green Bay or a UFO, but it illustrates that people in the old days spent a lot more time outside than we do today. Nearly half the country was involved in farming. Today, that's less than 1%. So they spent more time outside. In the summer, they'd come home, and if the house was too hot, they'd wait outside to it to cool off. If it didn't, they'd sleep out in the front yard. So it seems only fitting they would see weird things because they were out more than we are. Just as a little experiment for the next week, mentally keep track of how long you spend staring at the night sky. And if you're like most people, especially in the winter, it's probably not that long at all. Or what about this case out of Appleton? A mysterious airship flying over. Hundreds of people spotted it. Wasn't a cloud, wasn't a balloon. They had no idea what was going on. And that was very common with the airships, especially in 1897 when thousands of people in hundreds of Midwestern cities spotted these airships, the flap going over their city. But this next case, this final case, is a little bit closer to our own time. And I threw it in here because it's probably the weirdest case of a UFO encounter you might ever hear about. It happened in 1961 in Eagle River, Wisconsin, to this gentleman, Joe Simonton, a part-time farmer and a plumber who was having a late breakfast, early lunch at his house by himself, when all of a sudden he looked out the window and spotted this craft starting to descend into his yard. He said the craft was about 30 feet wide, 12 feet high, and had all these little metal depression rings or muffler-like objects on it. I have to give Simonton credit. He hadn't given much thought to UFOs before, so he wasn't frightened. Instead, he was curious. So he walked out to this thing, and he said an opening appeared like the trunk of your car flapping open. And there was one of the inhabitants. 2 others were seen inside. They were all identical looking, short, with dark hair, dark eyes, and dark skin. The eyes were so creepy, Simonton couldn't even look at them. He said they were all wearing identical outfits, and they reminded him of small Italian men. One of the aliens, the human, the pilot, the inhabitant, whatever it was holding a jug. And Simonton realized that they wanted water. So he grabbed the jug. There was no verbal communication at all. He went into his house and filled the jug with water. When he came back, he handed it to the leader, the presumed leader. When he looked over, one of the other things was cooking something on a flameless type grill or apparatus. Simonton motioned with his hand like eating. Are you going to eat that? He was trying to get some conversation going. The leader, recognizing his interest, went over and traded Simonton for the water by giving him several of what the media were calling UFO pancakes. I told you this case was going to be weird. Simonton ate one, said it was the worst tasting pancake he had ever had. Said, no wonder they're so small. If this is what they're eating, I can imagine. Simonton had no idea, but at the same time, people were calling in, reporting a UFO in the area. After the trade was done, the craft shut its door and flew off. Simonton ended up reporting the case. Within a week, 1,000 people had come to his farm looking for those alien pancakes. Eventually, the U.S. Air Force would show up. at Project Blue Book, looking into what he had experienced. Till the day he died, Simonton believed he had encountered something not of this planet. And he's not alone. Every year, hundreds of people still contact my colleague Noah Voss on his UFO Wisconsin website and report weird things in the sky. But as I'm running low on time for this program, here's what I hope you come away from this program. If you open up your newspaper, you turn on the television, you listen to NPR, or God forbid you consult the internet, you'll probably say something similar to this. The world has gone crazy. Can you believe how crazy the world is today? And I agree with you. The world is absolutely crazy today. But hopefully this program shows you that the world was crazy 100 years ago as well. It will probably be crazy 100 years from now when they look back at us and wonder what the heck we were doing. So that's what I hope you take from this program. And if you want more information, my website has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I really hope your adventure doesn't end here tonight. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of the Midwest. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird place. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some weird people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I want to thank the library. It's rare that you can come to a program like this at no cost. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a ton of work into getting me here. And I can't think of a time in America's history in which the library has played a more important role than it does in today's world. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, societal issues, the library is the fabric that keeps our communities together, a real treasure for any city who has one. So to show my appreciation, if you want to get any of my books, just type in the coupon code library at my website. You'll save 20% off everything just because the library is so awesome. So I'm going to flip it back to the library. And we can take some questions, comments, if you so choose.
Thank you, Chad. That was awesome presentation. And thank you for the library shout out there at the end. Does anybody have some questions for Chad tonight?
Yes, you can now see I'm a real person here and not some alien pancake trader.
I'm kind of curious to what they tasted like, even if they were the worst things he had ever eaten in his life.
He said they were very bland, very plain, and he had them analyzed. And some say they came back with nothing more than being average buckwheat pancakes that you can make at home. Some say they came back with ingredients not of this world. Others claim they didn't have salt in them, which is, of course, bringing us back to fairy lore of them hating salt and using salt to protect yourself from the supernatural. So, yes. I see someone with a question of Bray Road. Being that you're so close to Elkhorn, I was going to bring up the werewolf, the beast of Bray Road, but sightings are more modern than what we were talking about tonight. But thanks to my good friend and colleague Linda Godfrey, people started seeing and reporting to her along this stretch of road, small stretch called Bray Road, for lack of a better term, a giant werewolf type beast. Long snout, thick, dark, matted down fur, running upright on his hind legs like you and I do. But the good news is that outside of charging a couple vehicles, these creatures, wherever they are in the U.S., seem more destined to run back into the underbrush and remain undetected than they are at harming you. So if you go looking for them, most likely you won't die. Well, 50-50. Do so at your own risk.
That's actually that's actually a pretty good plug right there. Someone asking about a creature of Wisconsin, because that's actually Chad's going to join us again for our second annual Spooktober. And he'll be talking about mysterious creatures in Wisconsin. So we'll get to hear even more than just the Beast of Bray Road.
Yes, you'll get vampires, phantom chickens, werewolves, UFO creatures, you name it. In Wisconsin, we have it all.
Okay, now that's a great teaser, because I'm going to be curious now the whole entire time about the phantom chicken.
Oh, yes, those are creepier than they sound.
Hey, I can believe it. Chickens are, especially roosters, they can be kind of temperamental. Let's see. We do have something about a disappearing lake east of Whitewater on Bluff Road. So I'm sorry, Joe, was there a disappearance that happened, I guess, on that road?
Oh, that I'm not aware of, which is, I would love to hear more. And that's the beauty of doing these stories and this research that I've been researching for 20 plus years. And every time I do a program, I get new stories. I learn new things. So whoever that was, contact me. On my website has an email, phone number, even an address if you prefer that way. I'd love to hear more of that disappearing lake. I have cases of disappearing homes, disappearing people, but not grave sites, but not lakes that I know of. And keep in mind, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I could have done a 40-hour program and never ran out of stories. If you're ever bored on a rainy day or, I don't know, a pandemic, start flipping through the old newspaper archives from 100 years ago in your town, and you'd be amazed at how much weirdness you discover. And not only that, you start to get a real feel of your city. You start to see the same businesses advertising and the people talking about the neighborhoods. And it's a real fun way to attach yourself to the place you live in the old days. And you'll find some really, really weird stories.
Well, someone goes, hey, I'm ready for the 40-hour series.
Yes, I should do that, a marathon one. Wisconsin, just really weird stuff. I love it. I absolutely love it.
Let's see. We had two other things, I think, here. Something about gnome sightings. Have you heard about any gnomes?
Oh, yes. Wisconsin's full of gnomes, fairies, trolls, goblins, the hidden people, the good folk, you name it. And my Mysterious Creatures program, which I'm doing here in October, we're going to have tons of gnomes, not only people who see them, but some gnomes that are said to throw rocks at you and terrorize you. And I can also tell you some ways in which to keep yourself safe from the little people, to appease them, that when you're out looking for them, some things you can do so they will not curse you with bad luck. Years ago, it was thought that you'd have to do certain things to keep the little people from terrorizing you. And on your farm, if your livestock went ill or the crops weren't producing or you started tripping and became clumsy, that wasn't you. That was because the fairies were not happy with your offerings. So tune in to keep yourself safe from fairies. But we have tons of lore of little people and the good folk here in Wisconsin.
Very interesting. Just a couple more here. It looks like, if that's okay with you, don't want to keep you, later than you need to be. Let's see. Something about, have you ever investigated or heard anything about the Maribel Caverns Hotel?
Yeah, Maribel Caves, which is not too far from Manitowoc, small town of Maribel. In the 1900s, it was a fancy hotel used as a spa for the rich and famous. And over the years, it had a lot of tragedy, a lot of fires, a lot of people dying in those fires. And eventually, because there was an alleged portal to hell there, it received the name, the moniker, Hotel Hell. Not much of it's left. It was only the foundation, and a tornado took a lot of that down a few years back. But there's still some stuff you can see from the road, and people love it. Hotel Hell, crazy story. Yeah, I love Mirabel Caves.
Looks like last question here, it looks like someone had about Gravity Hill.
Yes, well, there are several in Wisconsin. One by Schallsburg that's probably
Yes.
the most infamous. And it's a hill that you park your car, put it in neutral, and you'd bet your life that you're moving uphill from this, usually the spirits of someone who died there, pushing your vehicle uphill. And you would swear, but a lot of them seem to be optical illusions. But there are some places where the spirits of kids that were killed on railroad tracks will push your car up over the tracks so you do not suffer the same fate that they did. Many people will sprinkle baby powder or flour on the back of their car. And when they're pushed over, they'll get out and see tiny little finger and handprints like ghostly kids pushing your car. So there are a lot of gravity hills or spook hills, as they're sometimes referred to, all over the U.S. And they're a lot of fun. Some things you can do to try it for yourself. You can bring a level to see if you're actually going uphill or downhill. Also, the easiest is just pour a bunch of water and it will run downhill. And sometimes you'll see that it's running what appears to be uphill.
That's a fun experiment or some kind of challenge. I know you like to do challenges. With the pandemic, have you done a challenge recently?
Yes. Well, the beauty of dares is a lot of them are out in the middle of nowhere. So you can go by yourself. And I travel where, I'm not interacting with anybody. So yes, I've been able to do a few. Winter settles in. That's harder because I used to use the winter to do my indoor dares at places, haunted hotels, cursed places. But I've taken a break because of the pandemic, but hopefully later this year, knock on wood, I'll be out there. The problem is I've taken so many of these dares that if one comes true, where most of them mean that you'll have mishap, misfortune, and death, I don't know which one to blame it on because I've done too many of them.
Oh my. Okay. Well, I guess we do have one last question. I lied the last time and said, but someone just snuck it in here. And I believe it was kind of answered because it's the Potawatomi legend of the Thunderbird of Geneva Lake. And I think that has something to do with the Lake Geneva or the Geneva Lake monster somehow, correct?
Well, these Thunderbirds were giant, monstrous birds. They came from, the first stories were told by the native peoples of the region. And they told of these creatures that were gigantic. They were called Thunderbirds because they often came during storms, but also that when they flapped their wings, it sounded like thunder. That's how big they were. Modern witnesses who have seen them say they're bigger than a small aircraft. But where they go, why they're not, we haven't found a body or a carcass, nothing. But the Thunderbird, which is thought to be some sort of supernatural being, has a long history in the Midwest of Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota. Yes, a lot of Thunderbird sightings.
I didn't know that. Oh. All right. So if there is nothing else, someone's going to sneak a question in there yet? No? Well, I'm going to thank you again tonight for this. It was always fascinating. So thank you so much for taking out your time to come and talk to us, Chad. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us. Like I said, Chad will be back with us 2 more times because we're going to learn even more about mysterious creatures and then I think winter creatures or winter
folklore and legends. Yes.
Yes, winter folklore and legends. There we go. You would know better than me. So thank you so much. And I wish everyone a good night. And like I said, if you missed any portion of it tonight, it will be available on our Facebook page for one.